Hey guys, Chrono, and what I want to talk to you about today is a new series that I'm starting. It's why Yu-Gi-Oh is struggling with consumers. The reason I wanted to address this, I've recently seen my local scenes dwindling, and I'm actually part of several different scenes that I go to, and I've noticed that they've actually been having a hard time just having enough people for there to be an actual tournament. And when you're in very prominent city areas and you're not seeing the same amount of turnout, then that makes me wonder, well, why? What's going on that's causing this to happen? And so I went and I talked with several of my friends through Facebook. I also talked with several other people through different forums that they're a part of. And there was one, or actually several things that ran together, but one of the biggest common threads that I kept hearing was the cost. It's very expensive to play Yu-Gi-Oh right now, more so than even just a few years ago. Yes, Yu-Gi-Oh has always had very expensive decks, but nowhere near where it's at right now, and I almost feel like it's getting out of control. To where Konami really needs to step in and do something, because if players feel that they can't be competitive, then they're probably going to switch to something else where they can be. At least that's my feeling based on players that I've talked with, because I've had several that they went ahead and started playing Magic. Others went to Vanguard. Some are even playing the new Dragon Ball Z game. And one of the main reasons they told me, this is a whole lot cheaper than Yu-Gi-Oh. One of the reasons that Yu-Gi-Oh is so expensive is because of key staple cards that players are forced, I almost feel, to play in order to be competitive. One of those cards being Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. That card's even had a reprint, but it's still currently around $50 to $60, and players are commonly running 3 copies of it. That would be around $150 to $160. And then also another key staple is the Firewall Dragon. The Firewall Dragon is also a very popular card right now, and it's around $40. So notice for just 4 cards, you're paying somewhere close to $190 to $230. And that's going to take its toll on the consumer. That's not cheap. But let's look at some other cards now that are also expensive. Okay, so the next thing that I want to look at is 2 very key trap cards that are very expensive right now in the Yu-Gi-Oh card game. So we've got Infinite there. This card just released, but it's extremely useful, and players are currently running 3 copies. Those 3 copies would cost $240. Yes, that's right. $80 a card. And Evenly Matched, which is also being run at 3 right now, is about $60 a card. So that'd be $180 for the entire set. So if you get all 6 cards, you're well over $400. And then if you add the other key staples that I've already mentioned, which costed around $230, you're well over $600 for cards you feel like you have to have in your deck in order for it to be competitive. That's a lot of money on consumers. Very expensive for just, oh gosh, 10 cards. Yes, that's a fourth of your deck, but wow, that's a lot of money in my opinion. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at the Nightmare decks that recently topped in May 2018. Look at that average cost, $808. Wow. I mean, that is a ton of money there. Staples that you see there, like the Unicorn Link card, that's $20. Some key monsters are also expensive, but the majority of the price is coming from key staples that players feel like they have to have in order for the deck to be competitive. Okay, let's look at Trick Stars now, which have been a blend of Sky Strikers and Trick Stars. Look at that. $1,410. The cheapest you see there is $626. And Trickstar has really expensive cards as well, like the Trap card there. That's close to around $60 on its own. And then the Spell card that you see there, that's also very expensive, Light Stage. So these decks are getting insane, in my opinion, in terms of price. Who has that kind of money? I certainly don't have almost $1,500 that I can spend on a 60 card deck. That's just a lot. I don't know how people can afford it. Okay, so at the time of the making of this video, Sky Strikers is the deck to own. And it has key staples that are extremely expensive to the deck, which is why if you look at that, the average deck cost is almost $1,200. Again, that is an extreme amount of money for a 60 card deck, and there's a good chance that within a year you're going to have to be done with it, because that's how this game works. You have to move on to something else usually, which is another reason why I think players have issues with Yu-Gi-Oh! They invest all this money, and then there's a ban list that comes out, and when that ban list hits, suddenly all that money that you've poured into a deck is not going to get you the same return that you were thinking that you were going to get from it. I actually had this happen for a deck that I had built for my son. He just won back in February his very first Dragon Duel. Very excited, getting his bid to Nationals. And so I decided, well, he was playing Pendulum Magicians, and I thought Heavy Metal Foes would be really important to invest in so that he'd have a chance when he plays these more top tier decks if he goes to Nationals. So I actually did something I very rarely do. I spent more than $10 on a card. And so I bought the card, it was $50, and then the ban list came out. And now the card is down to $25. And so the price that you spend in Yu-Gi-Oh! Usually is not what you get out of it if you decide to sell the deck and start over again, which is what we've actually had to do, because he needs a deck for Nationals and we don't have one because they hit that deck so hard. Now we have to find a different deck. So again, the return on your investment isn't always what you're anticipating that's going to be, especially when the ban list comes out and you've spent that money. Okay, but back to decks that have topped recently. So the Gem Knight First Turn Kill has been very popular recently. And notice the decks range from $150 to around $430. That's a little bit more reasonable. I think players are more likely to want to do that. But let's look at a deck, though, that usually is budget friendly, like ABC Dragon Buster. ABC Dragon Buster, because players are using those key staples that I talked with you about before, their decks are also getting very big in price, to where it's very common for them to also be spending more than $600–700 on an ABC Dragon Buster deck, when that used to be your budget deck of $100 or less. But because of this new format with hand traps being everywhere, notice that that is actually causing the price of these decks to skyrocket, and it's forcing the consumers to spend way more money than they probably want to. And we've been here before, because the pattern is the same with competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! New sets come out. The new sets are much more powerful than the old sets, especially because of the ban lists. So you find yourself spending more and more money every single set. So for example, if you look at in previous sets, Masterpiece, man, that card would wreck people. It was a $30 card at one point. Diagonal Diagram was also a really expensive card. It would be almost close to $90 per copy. And so, yes, you did have your expensive decks. However, the staples, which were so important to a deck, were much cheaper. So usually you saw decks costing, somewhere around maybe $500, $600, maybe even $700. Every now and then you'd see some decks that would get up there to around $800, but usually it wasn't that much more. And unfortunately, that's where we are. It is way, way more, which is a huge issue that needs to be fixed, because if you look at other card games like Magic, I mean, look at this with Magic. Look at the prices of these decks. So you've got decks that are around $200 to $500 that are competitive. And there's several of them, and they even have decks even cheaper than that are also still very competitive in their meta. Now, I know it's a real different situation because in Magic, they have seasons where you actually have to play certain decks. However, I think it's important to look at, because of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's only been a few decks that that I've seen that have really stuck around. And those decks would be ABC Dragon Buster, Burning Abyss, and some sort of Light Sworn variant. Those are the ones I see popping up the most. Every now and then I think you also see some dinosaur decks that pop up, but they've been hit pretty hard by the ban list. But again, why is the price of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! So much more than other card games? Because Magic's not alone. Vanguard and Dragon Ball Z typically have decks that are about the same price. Why is it so different with the Yu-Gi-Oh? And that's what I'm going to get into next here. So I have a theory as to why I think that the Yu-Gi-Oh card game is struggling. And I think that it has something to do with there's just not as many people playing the game as there once were. If you look at a report back in September 2016, there's a 52% drop in sales for the Yu-Gi-Oh card game in Japan. And I don't think that's just in Japan. And the reason I say that, if you notice, Konami keeps highlighting the mobile success that they've been having in games. So Duel Links, Winning 11, Card Collection, other mobile games that they've had quite a bit of success with, that's what they keep saying is responsible for their success. So when you have a shrinking audience, and this may be the case, I really don't know if this is the case or not, but when that happens, you have to come up with a strategy for the players to pay more for something. I liken this to smoking. Notice that a huge percentage of the population doesn't smoke anymore. So what did cigarette companies do? They raised the prices on the packs of cigarettes. Now, Konami is much cleverer than that. What they have done instead is they have decided we're going to have certain cards. These cards are going to be the most dominant cards in a set. Players are going to have to buy tons and tons of packs, or they're going to have to rely on companies that do that. And then those prices will go up, so we'll continue to sell our product. And because you have such a rarity, that is why I feel you're seeing the prices of these decks go so high, which is extremely hard for consumers to keep up with. And so I really feel that because of that, you're seeing a big drop in the Yu-Gi-Oh card game from players, and that's why you're seeing not as many people at the locals. That's why you're seeing so many people not keeping up with the game, because it's just too expensive. I mean, again, I ask you, who has $1,200 to $1,400 for a 60 card deck that is more than likely going to be part of the ban list in less than a year? That's a lot of money. And I just don't know who's got that type of cash lying around. The everyday person, myself included, does not. So what are some solutions now? What are some things Konami could do? Reprinting key staples, I think, is going to be huge for the company. Now, they have done that. They did it with Pot of Desires, they did it with Solemn Strike, but it needs to happen more frequently if you're going to keep players invested in the game. If you don't do that, I'm afraid, again, they're going to move to something that's more budget friendly. And then the last thing that I would suggest, continue to release awesome structure decks, like for example, Emperor of Darkness. That's when my son and I really embraced the competitive side of Yu-Gi-Oh! Because we could buy 3 of those, and we really didn't need anything else outside of those 3 structure decks back in 2016. That to me is the way to get players excited about the game. You come in, you try out those decks, you tinker with them, and then it makes you want to try other decks. Some might say, but yeah, that's when they had their downturn, was in 2016. Well, release more structure decks that would be compatible with the current format. Design it out for the year so that players can use those. The other thing is, what about box sets like Pendulum Evolution? That was a fantastic set. You could literally buy the box and you would have 90% of the cards that you needed for the core deck in that box. And those boxes were going as cheap as $30 to $40 at one point. That to me is a way to keep players in the game. These new box sets that are costing $80 and you might get 1 or 2 good pulls, that's not the way I feel to keep players excited about the format. So that's what I've got to say. I hope you guys found this video interesting. I hope that you will let me know what you think some of the big issues is money-wise when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'll see you guys next time.